Ever wonder why scam calls feel so specific? Why they somehow already know your name, your city, or even your address? It's usually because of data brokers. These companies collect your personal information from across the internet and sell it online, usually without you even realizing it. Things like your phone number, home address, family members, and even places you've lived. And once your information is out there, it spreads fast. That's where Aura comes in. Aura automatically finds your personal information on data broker sites and submits removal requests for you. Then Aura keeps monitoring to help make sure your information stays gone. You can even see where your data was found and removed. And Aura goes beyond data removal. You also get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Right now, you can try Aura free at aura.com/hidden. That's aura.com/hidden.
Welcome back to Drafting the Past. This is a show about how historians write history, and I'm your host, Kate Carpenter. Today's episode is a first for Drafting the Past. I got to talk to a married couple about how they wrote a book together. I'm delighted to welcome Scott W. Stern and Dr. Charles O'Malley to the show.
Thank you so much.
We're so thrilled to be here. Thank you for talking to us.
Scott is a writer and lawyer who's the author of 2 previous books of narrative nonfiction. He's also written for many media outlets, as well as scholarly journals. Charlie is a dramaturg and writer who edited a book titled Toward a Just Pedagogy of Performance and has worked at theaters across the country. Together, they teamed up to write a new book titled Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen. In it, they explore Shakespeare's character Margaret, a woman loosely based on a historical figure who is the only Shakespearean character, male or female, whose entire life appears on stage. They introduce readers to her historical model, her creation by Shakespeare, and her evolution across centuries of performances to show how the character of Margaret illuminates the world in which she is created and brought to life. As they put it, her story shows how Shakespeare's plays have always been living collaborations among actors, directors, writers, critics, and history itself. It seems only fitting that the book itself was a close collaboration. Scott and Charlie are co-writers, but they also began working on the book together shortly after they got married. We talked about how they navigated intertwined domestic and writing lives, as well as the challenges of bringing different voices and backgrounds together on the page. They both join me for this conversation. You'll hear Scott's voice first. Enjoy my conversation with Scott Stern and Charles O'Malley.
So I've written 2 books of narrative nonfiction aimed at a popular audience, although my hope was that they would be academically rigorous. So the first one I wrote, it emerged actually out of research that I was doing when I was in college. It was my college thesis, and I was just really into it. And so I kept doing it full time after college, and then as I continued with my got a law degree and I became a lawyer, I kept working on it, and then it became a book, and that's called The Trials of Nina McCall, which is about a largely forgotten U.S. government program under which the federal government and state governments imprisoned tens of thousands, likely over 100,000 women and girls who were suspected of having sexually transmitted infections. And then that research sort of tangentially led into my second nonfiction book, which was published last year. And it's called There is a Deep Brooding in Arkansas, which is a history of sexual violence and the legal process in the Jim Crow South. And then, I was kind of, after I finished drafting that, I was looking around for a new project. And that kind of dovetails, I think, with Charlie's answer here.
So I'm a theater person. I was in grad school for dramaturgy at the Yale School of Drama, which is where I met Scott, not in the drama school, but in New Haven. So I got my master's degree and my doctorate there. Dramaturgy, for any listeners who aren't familiar, is kind of it's the academic and theoretical background to drama and theater. Dramaturgs are kind of to plays the way that editors are to books. So people that work with either directors on reviving old plays or playwrights on creating new work. So that was what my training was in. I was writing my dissertation, which is a performance history. And I was wrapping that up a number of years ago when Scott and I were chatting. He was finishing up the Arkansas book, chatting about next projects. And then we decided to jump into kind of co-creating a project. And that's how this book came to be.
Well, before we dig into the book more, I do want to just know how you like to work. So when and where do you guys like to do your writing?
So I think for this project, we were trying to find a time when we could like work simultaneously and therefore, like kind of draw energy from the other and kind of hold the other accountable. And so this is a little different for me than like previous projects. But the way that we did this was like we were both working largely full-time jobs, throughout the process that we were writing this book. And neither of us is presently in academia. So the period of time when we had the most time to do the writing was after dinner. So for a couple of years after dinner, pretty much every night, we would start researching and writing. I sat on the couch. Charlie sat at a table, and we would just work for a couple hours until usually one of us would be like, all right, you want to watch some TV? Like when we were ready to call it a day. So that was largely our process until we had kids, which was very late in the process of writing this book. So I look back very nostalgically on this time when we had like these like vast, hours after dinner when we didn't have to, like there was no bath time and there was no wrangling toddlers. Yeah.
How do you like to organize yourselves?
Well, we started work on this. I was actually just looking at a calendar, and we started work on this project 5 years and one day ago. We were talking about, beginning to work and what this would look like. And I had done a little bit of research on Shakespeare during my comprehensive exams in grad school. And if you work in the theater, you're always working with Shakespeare too. So Scott had a lot of catching up to do because I had kind of all of that theoretical and that academic background there. But when on that day that we started working on it, the first thing that Scott did was he created a shared Google Drive folder. And that's where we kind of updated everything. And we were keeping everything saved there. We have so many saved documents. We had to buy extra storage on our Google account. And we would keep ourselves, or we created this incredibly long outline for what the whole book was going to look like, almost on the paragraph level of how this narrative was going to progress. Because sometimes when you're writing, we've both written projects by ourselves and you can keep a lot in your brain, but here we had to get everything out. We had to talk through everything because neither of us wanted to make assumptions about where the other person was. Whether it was me making assumptions about, oh, of course you know this thing about this one theorist from the 18th century, or Scott, who has more experience writing narrative nonfiction, thinking about, Charlie, this is not necessarily how you're going to structure this, right? So we were kind of constantly going back and forth on this. And when we were working on chapters, we would kind of basically separate section by section of the chapter who had written what, who was going to work on what. And we'd send those back to each other. And then I'd make notes on Scott's, he'd make notes on mine, and then we'd send them back and send them back and send them back until we could put it all together in a Word document. We went chapter by chapter through the whole book. And so now we have these, 500-page long Google Docs of all of our notes and stuff, which don't actually open because they're too large.
Yeah, they crash now every time.
Yeah, they crash every time you try to open one of these Google Docs. But then, after, a year or two of writing, it really starts to look like a book. And then we could start, sending it to some people that we wanted to read, to our agent, as we were, working on actually moving from the draft section or the draft version to something that looks more like a book.
How'd you keep track of all your research? Was that just Google Doc notes?
So we did something that I have never done before. I don't think Charlie had ever done it before either. We created this like monster document that we called taxonomy of sources. And I think a lot of this ordinarily, like Charlie said,
sounds like something an academic would do.
Right, exactly. Like ordinarily, I think you could
taxonomy.
Yeah, you could have a taxonomic structure in your head, but like we needed to externalize this because it was communicating as much as it was memorializing, research. And so it is a really unwieldy document, but it served its purpose of being like, it's not as good. If I read a book and then took notes on it and put it in the taxonomy, it's not as good as if Charlie also read it, but it's better than nothing. And so we probably, each went through the vast majority of the sources. We each went through them twice, basically, but it served this like communicative purpose of not just the information in the book, but also what we each considered important about the information in the book or article or source or whatever it was. So it was largely through that taxonomy and then a separate document that was this massive timeline, which I have done for all projects that I've done because I kind of think chronologically. And it just is like, you often notice these coincidences if you keep everything in this really pointillist day by day calendar. And so we could realize like, oh, this thing was happening in 1586 and this other thing was happening in 1586, and maybe there was, some influence there, that kind of thing.
And a fun thing that I want to add about the timeline is, it's chronological. So we started with some really, really early dates. I think probably Edward III is the first person that shows up on our timeline. That's the 1300s. And it goes all the way up into the present day. So we have things like, at the end, we have things like historical events that are happening, productions that are happening with people we know in 2023, 2024. And so that kind of also helped to put into context in our brains, because that's what our book does. It goes all the way from 100 Years' War up to the present, following this character. It helps put into our brains. But, the project that we're doing is also a part of this story, because we can be in contact with these people, that some of the more recent people. So it's weird to see your name and Shakespeare's name on the same timeline.
I imagine. What was it like to edit each other as you were working on revising and bringing everything together?
Well, we have different approaches, but
gentle way of putting it.
but I mean, marriage is about communication, and I think this taught us that, just as much as raising children or buying a house. No, we really, I mean, we have different backgrounds, but I think that was something that we shared with our backgrounds. I, as mentioned, come from theater, and theater is all about collaboration. And it is all about putting your ideas out there and having collaborators who you trust, whether they be an actor or lighting designer or producer or an audience member, come to you and say, this doesn't make sense to me. And that's kind of what dramaturgs are supposed to do. We're supposed to keep one foot in and one foot out so that we can see something the way that an audience would see it. That was really what I brought to the process. Scott, he is a writer who's worked solo for a long time. And so he had a very particular eye for what the voice should look like, how to include different characters, how to include new characters. So he was constantly kind of like training me in that. And I was trying to be open, say, this is something I've never done before. I've never written narrative nonfiction like this. So I was trying to, really get that from him. Scott, what is your answer to this question? I'm curious to hear.
Well, the short answer, that was very diplomatically put, Charlie. The short answer that we usually tell people, and it's true, is like, I like editing and Charlie likes being edited. And the reverse is not, it's not totally untrue, but like like those are, I would say, our instincts. And so part of this was leaning into that. And part of it was also, trying to fight instinct. And so obviously I needed to be receptive to feedback. And I'm, used to feedback from my agent or my editor, but it was a, pretty foreign experience for me to get feedback this early in the writing process with the writing this raw. And I think for Charlie, who comes from in theater, like a more strictly academic background, I think that there was some amount of just communication between the two of us about like how you, as you say, like introduce a character and like what kind of information can you assume that your reader will have or understand. I remember we had this debate about whether like your average reader would know who August Schlegel was. And I was like, there's no way. And you were like, everyone knows who that is. And so I think we did end up having to like introduce him, but it was conversations like that. And so I think it, from my perspective, I think it made me a more generous writer, but it also, I hope, made the book better because it united two different sensibilities. And so ensured that it had a kind of broader purview.
Well, no, like August Schlegel, like first of all, it's Schlegel. No. I mean, what I was going to say is, well, something that also is very helpful is that I have a lot of Shakespeare training, and Scott was learning a lot about Shakespeare. So it was very helpful throughout the process to have someone say, we need to talk about this. We need to explain a little bit more. And people aren't necessarily going to remember this. It's very helpful for our future readers that hopefully that the movie of Hamnet just came out, because it reminds people a lot about, that, for example, women were not allowed to be performers at this time in England. This is what it would have felt like going to the theater. And that's a lot of what we're trying to get into in this book, is to remind people about what the material conditions of theater going or art making were in this time, because they really affect the words that got on the page at the end of the day in both Shakespeare's plays, but in the other plays of the Elizabethan playwrights. And so I think that it was helpful to have kind of a someone who was learning what a lot of this a lot of the scholarship on Shakespeare was saying. And then that helped both of us to step back and say, all right, this is how we need to be introducing this. This is what we need to be reminding people. This is what we're introducing this here. This is what we need to remind people 10 pages later, because we want to make sure that the book is readable for anyone who has any sort of interest in Shakespeare or theater, but might not necessarily remember all of these names from the Wars of the Roses or from the history plays.
Sure. That seems tremendously helpful. Were there other people that you turned to for feedback along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the benefits of there being two authors of this book is that we have double the communities. So we have twice the former faculty, twice the friends, twice the acquaintances, twice the colleagues, and so we turned to a lot of people for input in ways like large and small. It was a lot of like asking people to think about a particular section or even a particular question, and like, does this ring true to you? Does this seem like a respectful way of putting this particular thing? And does this make sense holistically?
If I read correctly, your marriage and this book are pretty closely intertwined. You've been working on this book through your whole marriage. Is that right?
Yes, that is right.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think we got married a year before we started, right?
Yeah, we got legally married in the summer of 2020, but then it was COVID, so our wedding itself was the summer of 2021, and we started this process in the middle there, so it was quite early in our marriage.
It strikes me that you were learning to communicate as co-authors at the same time that you were learning to communicate as spouses, as partners. Was that challenging? How did you not kill each other, I guess, is part of my question.
It wasn't challenging for me at all. I think it was actually helpful, because I think it helped us to communicate about a whole bunch of different things. And I know that, there are all types of relationships out there and all are wonderful, but I cannot imagine being married to someone who I couldn't talk to about my work, and being able to work together on something is great. I always said I didn't want to end up with someone who worked in the theater, because I need a little bit of separation from my work life, and someone needs to make money. But it's wonderful having someone who can appreciate that and who can engage with it. And so to me, this was just another way of, we talk about politics, we talk about going to the movies, we talk about our friends and family members, and then we talk about the Margaret book. And that was just a really wonderful thing for us to have. And I really don't remember any major disagreements about the book.
I mean, we disagreed on small things.
Unless I just blocked it out, like a lot of
We disagreed on small things all the time. I don't think we had any significant disagreements, in part because we both, I think, went in with some degree of humility. You had never written a solo author monograph before. I had far less background in Shakespeare. I was like a fan, but definitely not a scholar of Shakespeare or his work or his times. I think like people often like sort of want a much more dramatic answer to this question. But no, it was quite a collaborative process.
The real problem is that we finished writing the book in the spring of 2024, and then our twin boys were born in the summer of 2024. So that made the rest of the process more difficult because of the whole sleep deprivation thing. Yeah, and it did make the editing process more difficult, because we now have all of these two little fellows running. Well, they weren't running at first, but they're now running. And so that's made that process more difficult. But, I think that everybody has, ways to work around their careers and their kids when they're trying to get their
thank goodness they were born when they were, because at the beginning they just sleep all the time. If we were trying to like rewrite sections or make edits now, it would be like impossible. I mean, they're just so much more time consuming. We were sleep deprived as hell, but we had plenty of downtime, and now, kind of the opposite is true.
I want to talk a little bit more about the book specifically, which I really enjoyed. It's hard to exactly describe this book, especially from a genre perspective, right? Because it's a biography, but it's a biography of a character who is a fictional character, but also a real person. And there is some overlap between those two people, but not entirely. It's also a history of Shakespeare and time and context, and then a history of the theater past Shakespeare. So there's a lot happening in this book.
Yeah, there is.
It seems like that would have been really hard to bring that all together in a way that flowed smoothly, that made sense. How did you think about structuring it? I know you mentioned an outline that was almost to the paragraph level.
Yeah, it became pretty clear early in our conversations that we wanted a narrative. So not like thematic chapters, like this is a chapter on, Margaret's anger in Shakespeare characters, and this is a chapter on her love and shit. Like that is certainly a valid approach, but we were going for more of a narrative, and that kind of lent itself naturally to a chronology. And so we felt that the thrust of the book, or like the meat of the narrative, really needed to focus on the birth, so to speak, of this character, and then her like maturation over the centuries. And so we devoted quite a lot of the book to the late 1580s, early 1590s, which is the period when Shakespeare's writing these plays, many of them with collaborators. And that allowed us to devote a chapter to say, like, here's what it would have been like as Shakespeare was writing Henry VI Part 2. Here's what was happening in London at the time. Here's what his like collaborators were doing. Here's what the Queen was doing. And then we would simultaneously narrate the play on the stage. And that would give us an excuse to talk about the play and its themes and its text without, sort of devolving into a less narrative critical analysis of the play. So we were kind of smuggling a lot of like attempted critical insights into a broader narrative. And it was only fairly late. So that structure that I just described, starting with the quote unquote birth of Margaret in like the 1580s and 90s, and then tracking the character over the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and into the 21st centuries, that was true from our first outline. One of the only significant things that changed was the addition of the first chapter, providing like a kind of like a biographical précis of Margaret of Anjou, the historical figure, in the first chapter. We had something kind of like that, but it was different in the first chapter. And I think it was important just to give readers some grounding. And it also worked with the chronological approach, because that was the 15th century. And then the Shakespeare narrative starts in the 16th century. So that was our approach, was this kind of, narrative story, but with a way to smuggle in critical dissections of these four plays, which are the primary source for the character of Margaret.
We did have a North Star through this whole process, and that is that this character is fascinating. And she stands out in Shakespeare's body of work. She appears in 4 plays. She does things that no other character does. She talks so much. And she's one of the first characters he's written. And she is one of the most complex characters he's written, right up there with people like Othello, Iago, Lear, Hamlet. She's right up there with them. And there's so much of her. And so we really wanted to get into this character, how she's depicted, what influenced the writing of this character, because she's not necessarily one of the characters that people are going to remember from high school English or even college English classes, because people don't really focus on the history plays, but there's a lot there. And actors have always been drawn to this character, not just because she's the biggest female role in all the canon, and half of all the actors want one of the roles that they can play, but because she's unusual. And so we wanted to find every different way we could get into this, whether that be the things that inspired Shakespeare and any collaborators at the time, or things that have inspired all of the actors and directors, dramaturgs, editors, producers, etc., who have touched the character in the centuries since. And so knowing that we always just wanted to be coming back to this character to figure out who she is, that helped us to determine what was important in terms of the biography of the real person, in terms of biography of the creator, Shakespeare, and the biographies also of all of the other people in the intervening centuries who've touched her.
Were there things that you wanted to include that didn't fit into that structure?
Oh my God, I held such a candle for the peasant uprisings of the 16th century. I drafted so much text and just could not find a place to quote unquote smuggle it in. I tried really hard. And Jack Cade was this really cool peasant rebel in the play Henry VI Part 2. I tried so hard, but it did not happen.
Yeah, I think we also had a lot more context about the 100 Years' War, which is the conflict between England and France that led to the Wars of the Roses, which is a civil war in England. And it just wasn't necessary for the narrative. The one thing that I really regret not having in the book is there's this 20th century production that had happened in Honduras. And it was this repertory production that lasted for decades. performed by the indigenous people of this island. And it was just an incredible story. And we actually have photographs from that production, but we could not get the legal rights to publish them. And, that's just the way that, publishing works and copyright works. And I would love to include the photographs because they're so evocative. But, that's the way that that copyright works. In some future world, maybe we can find a way to publish this.
To take a closer look at their approach to writing, I asked Scott and Charlie if they would read an excerpt from chapter 2 of their book so we could talk about it in more detail. Here's Charles O'Malley reading from chapter 2 of Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen.
Just weeks before this play debuted, a young man strode through the seedy, vibrant London suburb of Shoreditch. His name was William Shakespeare. This provincial youth had only recently arrived in the big city, or more accurately, its lively outskirts, and it was likely there, working alongside friends, that he began to create the character of Margaret. To the young Shakespeare, this place must have seemed like the center of the world. Born in 1564, he had come of age in Stratford-upon-Avon, a leafy provincial market town about 100 miles from the country's capital. His father, John Shakespeare, was a farmer's son on the make. He had risen from ale taster to high bailiff, essentially town mayor, in just 6 years. Will's mother, Mary, had come from a family of means with ancestors who had fought in the Wars of the Roses. Young Will had thus grown up with access to literacy, to education, and even to theater, which his father, as bailiff, had overseen. Yet sometime around Will's 15th birthday, for reasons still somewhat obscure, his father's reputation and finances began to crumble. Will apparently left school. He grew up fast. Over the next 5 years, he would marry a local woman named Anne Hathaway, who would bear him 3 children. His life in the years immediately following this swift family formation is so mysterious that the period is known as his lost years. Almost all that scholars can say for sure is that at some point between 1585 and 1592, the young man, now in his 20s, likely left his wife and small children and found his way to London, and more specifically to Shoreditch, intent on joining the theater.
So this is admittedly a little bit of a random passage. And one thing I have trouble with in picking passages for people to read in really well-constructed books is that it's hard to just pull a little bit out, right? Because everything kind of builds on each other. So anyway, I just say that to say that there are lots of wonderful passages in this book. I picked this one partially because I want to talk about voice. This could have been a sort of dry theater history book, and it is decidedly not. It's very engaging. Honestly, I like Shakespeare, but I'm not like a person who reads a lot of Shakespeare scholarship. And I wasn't sure that I would be that into this book, and I really enjoyed it. Couldn't stop reading it. I was wondering how you thought about voice while you were writing, especially as, combining 2 voices and trying to kind of have a shared way of writing. But I also wondered, did you have an ideal reader in mind? Did you think consciously about the voice of this narrative?
Yeah, we talked a lot about it. Well, we both read each other's work a lot. And so we both know how the other one writes. And there are times when I even go back to the book now and I think, oh, that's a word that Scott definitely put in there. I don't think I really used that word. But we actually read a lot of the same books as we were starting, and we talked through them. We would refer them, we'd say, oh, here are 1, 2, 3, and 4 books that I like, that I would like to talk about. And Scott said, here are a couple more. And we'd read them or listen to audiobooks of them. And we talk about what they like, what we did that they liked, and what we did that they didn't like. And, what was important to us is that it be accessible to a reader who has just a passing interest in this. So in terms of things like tone, structure, vocabulary of our sentences, we wanted to make sure that everything could really flow and that there wouldn't be hard cuts. In terms of our ideal reader, I mean, I thought a lot about my colleagues in theater and, would this be something that they would think a little on the academic side, or would this be something exciting? And then I thought a lot about my friends and family members outside of theater, people who go to the theater sometimes, people who maybe would have, as I mentioned, like seen or read Hamnet or Shakespeare in Love, have like a little bit of background there, but really are comfortable with kind of going on a journey. So we did think about it certainly in novelistic terms, in terms of how, from page 1 to page 10 to page 50, you're going to become more and more involved in the story.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, as Charlie mentioned a bit ago, like Part of the process for us of writing this book was divvying up chapters into like chunks, and then we would each draft independently and then exchange and edit the other's work. And so in that process, there was some amount of smoothing our respective voices to try to make a unified authorly voice. And part of that was like excising certain tics that we each have. Like I tend to overuse weather as like a scene setting tool. So like it was a dark and stormy night kind of thing. That's a lot more difficult to do if you're writing about the 16th century. But, as we got into the 19th and 20th centuries, that became possible in the way that I've done it in previous books, which is largely like using like newspaper almanac accounts of the weather. But we couldn't do that too much or it would just start sounding weird. Charlie, tends for certain formulations. He makes a lot of use of like not X, but Y. And so we were trying to like both of those sort of things, like weather or that formulation, like both of those are fine. But if it were only in like every other section or every other chapter of the book, that would start to seem really jarring. So a big part of our process was just trying to create a voice that was true to each of our independent voices, but also like read as unified and not like disjointed in some way.
And again, we're working toward the same goal too. So it's, we wanted to really bring to life a lot of history that we're going into. We describe a couple battles of the Wars of the Roses, but also we wanted to talk a lot about Shakespeare. I'm sorry, a lot about theater through the years. So we wanted to try to really get people to know what it was like to see Restoration drama. Remember that, for example, up until recently, for hundreds and hundreds of years, theater was lit by flame, by live flame, and there was no amplification. So we need to, think about that. What does that look like? How does that feel like? What are the social? When does the social breakdown of an audience change? From either in Shakespeare's time, when it was kind of all classes, leading into the 18th century, became something where people would sit in various parts of the theater. I mean, that happened in Shakespeare's time too. Sit in various parts of the theater based on class. And then we move into 19th, 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, into the 21st century, we're seeing theater that is experimental, avant-garde. So when we're talking about those productions, we want to talk about, what the texture and feel of that theater going experience is like, in the same way that we did in the 18th century, in the same way that we did, in Elizabethan times. So, trying to recreate that theatrical experience, which performance historians always have a really hard time with because performance is ephemeral. We have to find a way of trusting the sources that we have to recreate what these artistic experiences are like.
Yeah, that's interesting because I also want to talk about how you really bring places and people to life in this book. There is that texture, as you said, Charlie, that's kind of that focus on physical detail that really makes you feel almost like you were there in the theater or walking the street here with Shakespeare. Did you have strategy? I mean, how did you look for those details? How did you make sure that it felt that way in the reading?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, like I think that there were certain narrative nonfiction tricks that like I and many people have made use of in the past that are much more, for me at least, applicable to like a 19th or 20th century, for instance, U.S. history than it would be to like the 16th century when like we don't have a huge supply of like diaries or there weren't like newspapers that have survived in the same way. And so it's harder to say, like, on a particular Tuesday in May, this exact thing was happening with this exact person, and the weather was such. And so we looked for those kinds of details where we could find them. One excellent source was archaeological studies of the places where Shakespeare lived and worked, because of just the sheer amount of attention that scholars and enthusiasts have paid to Shakespeare and his times and collaborators over the centuries. And we know a whole lot about like the Rose Theater or the theater, which was the name of a theater. And like there have been like archaeological studies of the Rose, for instance, that give quite a lot of information, like the exact dimensions, how many people it would have sat, what the acoustics would have sounded like were there literally rats living in the thatches and the roof. So that kind of detail comes from archaeology, which for me was a new source, I think, for people who work on older periods than I usually do. That's a more common source. As we got into the 19th and 20th centuries, all of a sudden we start having the profusion of newspapers and theater reviews and like letters and diaries that we have more easy access to that give us that kind of detail. And so we were basically using different methods to summon those kind of descriptions for different time periods into the late 20th and early 21st centuries when we have YouTube recordings of like a bunch of the plays. So pretty much every major production of these plays post, World War II, we have a recording of that. It's either up online or you can get access to it. And so we're able to say like, she turned and she looked and she did X in a way that we can't for like, what it would have looked like in 1650 or 1590.
It strikes me that one of the advantages you have as co-authors who also live together is that you're not just writing together, but sort of separately, but that your whole milieu is part of the writing process, that you could be discussing the book over breakfast or while you're doing dishes, which I imagine could also drive you crazy. But but it seems like that must have helped in sort of combining your voices and making it go smoothly, because you kind of were like workshopping things as you were just engaging in your daily life. Did you find that was part of the practice, or did you try to separate when you were working on the book and when you were just living?
I'd say we talked about it all the time. We were, really, really in constant communication about it, in the same way that we would be about gossip about our friends or something, something that from our family members or something. I mean, we had to set aside time because we needed time that we could both work, especially because we're not, as Scott was mentioning, in an academic position where we have dedicated time in our in our Monday to Friday set aside for our research. But yeah, I mean, it was really constant. It helps that all of our sources are in the same home. It's like I'm looking at them right now; they're across the room from me, and so we were just kind of constantly churning and thinking through these things. We didn't have to like email each other in the middle of the night because we could just talk in the middle of the night about this new source that had come in or something like that.
For me, at least, so much of like the insight I'll have about like, oh, this is how I should structure it, or I should bring this detail in, happens like when you're not specifically thinking about it. It's when you let your brain go to other ways. So, the cliche is like you think of things in the shower, which for me personally happens all the time. Or like I'll think of something right as I'm falling asleep, and I'm like, I always have this conversation with myself where I'm like, will I remember that? Like, of course I'll remember that. Or do I need to write it down? And the answer is I always need to write it down, because I never actually, no matter how like brilliant it seems, I'll never actually remember it unless I write it down. But that kind of thing happened even more since there's so much of our sort of quotidian domestic lives that we share. And so it's like, whatever, washing the dishes or walking home from whatever, one of us will have an insight and just like sort of blurt it out to the other. And that kind of serendipity was shared, which was unexpected for me, but was really nice. And I also think was generative, because it gave two people to remember the one random comment that was blurted out in the middle of the night. And so it doubled our odds of success.
There are a couple of practical questions I want to ask you about. And actually, Scott, this one is more for you. So if I'm not mistaken, it was your agent who then took on this project to sell, right?
Yes.
I have sometimes talked to authors who worry about, like having a brand and a type of book that they write and sell, and that like some agents, that matters to them. Was that something you thought about with this book? Because it's a little far afield from your previous work.
It is, yeah. It was something I thought about, because I mean, I was, even before we started writing this book together, I was working on a different project, which is much more in my wheelhouse. It's like 20th century history of the US. And I'm still working on it, and I'm hoping that will be my next project. And this is very far afield from that. But like, for me, the way I thought about it was one of the benefits of not being in an academic position is that I have a ton more freedom. I don't have to think about like what will get me tenure. I don't have to think about a tenure clock. And like, the kinds of books that I write are for a general audience, but they're not like mega bestsellers. So I'm not as concerned about like I want something to be of interest to a large number of people, and I want a publisher to buy it, but I don't need it to sell 1 million copies. And so it doesn't need to like, I'm not going to shape the book proposal. I'm not going to abandon a proposal that I care a lot about because an agent or an editor thinks that a different proposal will work better. Like for me, the project that I'm passionate about is more important, and I'm fine, not making much money from this. So for me, it was like, I found this really cool. As Charlie, I think, mentioned, like, this was something he was kicking around even before he started his dissertation. And I kept encouraging him to turn it into a book, and he kept demurring. And so finally, I thought the only way to get him to do it was I said, if you really want, I'll co-write it with you. And that was, I think, what eventually convinced him that we should do this. because I thought this was such a cool idea. I had come across Margaret in a high school English class when we read Richard III and thought she was really cool. But I hadn't ever read the Henry VI plays, and I certainly hadn't seen them on stage. And so I wasn't even aware that there was that much more there to this character. And I was particularly struck by the fact that like so many people, like, lay people have never ever heard of her. And like what a cool story, and also what a cool formal experiment trying to do a like cradle to grave biography, but of a fictional character, someone who never actually existed. It would pose different sort of methodological challenges to my previous projects. You would have a different kind of archival approach. And so all of that struck me as like fun. And so I was less concerned about like diluting my brand, because my brand is not that valuable. And so I was comfortable, doing this. And I'm just really glad I did, because, I learned a lot, obviously, about the subject matter, but also about writing and co-writing and my own approach and my own foibles. I think it puts me in a better position as I return to independent work, which Charlie is as well.
What's your approach to marketing this book? I think I read in a piece that you published that the whole family is going on book tour and to promote the book. How has that gone?
We're fortunate to work with great marketing and publicity folks at Norton. And so, we're trying to find all the different audiences for this book, whether they be through Shakespeare theatrical circles, but also people that are interested in stories of powerful queen figures or European history. We are going on a book tour in August where we are taking the toddlers with us, and very excited about that. Hitting up some East Coast. We live on the West Coast, hitting up a number of East Coast locations. We're doing some West Coast ones separately as kind of day trips. So if everyone listening could say a prayer for us that it goes well, because we're going to be taking them around to a whole bunch of different cities. But really exciting. We're doing some events also with guests. We have actresses who are going to be performing with us at some of our book events, performing some pieces from the plays. We're going to be in Los Angeles. Our event is going to be co-produced by the Pasadena Playhouse. So we're hoping to get, a little bit of cross-promotion there from our theatrical connections.
Fantastic. I love that. Many historians get to have people perform Shakespeare at their book events.
I know. It's so cool.
It's always something that Shakespeareans will say over and over again. These plays were not written to be read; they're written to be heard. And so when you hear someone jump into it and you hear the words aloud, it really just kind of shakes you in a different way. Scott and I were just listening to the audiobook. There's a fantastic narrator who does the audiobook, also a performer, and a stage actress. And she really just jumps into the sections of Shakespearean text, and it just kind of shakes you out of your seat when you're listening. So it's really wonderful to it's because theater is an interactive art form. It's wonderful to have those kind of added things in there.
That's awesome. I had another sort of practical question, which is that I noticed in your acknowledgments, you have a note talking about the importance of the Internet Archive's lending library, which is now defunct, but how important it was to your ability to research this book, and how important it is or was for people maybe outside of institutions to be able to access scholarship. Can you talk a little bit more about how that resource was so crucial to writing this book?
Yeah, so the Internet Archive's Controlled Digital Lending Program, I think it was called, was something that was greatly expanded right at the start of COVID. And it basically gave access to a whole bunch of books, some that were centuries old and some that were relatively recently published. And you could borrow them virtually, like on the internet for an hour. And you could renew that. So you could, functionally, you could read through a whole book and take notes, and then the book would go back and you would lose access to it. And that was for two people who were doing this without, the benefit of like a academic library system with which we were affiliated, and without the benefit of like research funding. That was absolutely vital. I mean, there are so many books that, works of Shakespeare scholarship that were like published in the 30s or whatever, that are like kind of obscure. And so like our local library's interlibrary loan program couldn't capture it. And sometimes we couldn't even find them like on eBay, but they were there on the Internet Archive, and they were one click away. That kind of a resource was absolutely vital to two people working outside of the tenure system. And it is, I think, it is a real shame. And I have stronger wording that I won't use, that some large publishers basically colluded to shutter it under threat of litigation, actually under force of litigation. I think it's a real blow to that kind of scholarly inquiry because it really democratizes the access to knowledge. I know of some other nonfiction writers and journalists who have said they couldn't have written their own books without this resource. And I'm kind of nervous about, like, I've already come across the challenges of relying on alternative means of finding these books now that this resource is unavailable for my next project.
The challenges of sort of for independent researchers or people who don't have that academic affiliation of accessing information is, it's such a challenge. And I think that the more people who don't end up in tenure track jobs and don't have that kind of resource, the bigger this problem is going to be. I want to, before we kind of wrap up, I want to know some about your influences. So I wonder if you could each tell me the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten.
I have a whole lot. When I was in grad school, we would do a criticism workshop where we'd all read each other's works every Wednesday for 3 years. And that really just broke you completely down and built you completely back up. I still have the words of my old department chair in my head, which is thinking and writing are the same thing. You cannot write clearly if you can't think clearly, and vice versa. You need to absolutely know what you're going to say before you start writing. I know many people would disagree with that. Many people, have their own processes, but for me, that is just absolutely key to whenever I, open a Word document.
For me, it was a professor I was very close with when I was in college, Glenda Gilmore, who was a fabulous historian and writer. And she had a number of sort of aphorisms that she would use that I think about all the time. One was just a phrase that she used called the big so what? Like, what is it why do we care about this thing? You always have to be foregrounding and thinking about the big so what. Another Glenda-ism was like, know your characters. Who going into it, or even for like a purely academic work or a journal article, who is a reader going to care about? And the final one was, I actually don't remember the exact wording of what this was, but it was basically like, if you are struggling to put something into words and then, just try to like basically explain it to someone else or explain it out loud. And whatever words you use, even if they're less formal, just use those because that's the actual way that you'll get your meaning across.
I like those.
Can I throw one more in?
Please.
Scott name dropped one of his professors, so I will name drop one of mine as well. Gordon Rogoff, who has left us, but this is a helpful piece of advice if you're thinking about the arts. Maybe not so much for your other listeners. Always follow the money. All questions in theatrical history and the arts can be traced to who is paying, who benefits financially. So certainly in performance history, in art history, something we need to think about.
Yeah,
certainly the case in Shakespeare's London.
I think that applies to everyone. I don't think that's just arts.
Yeah, I do as well.
Awesome. I'm also wondering who you read. Are there books that you turn to for writing inspiration? Can you recommend any?
I personally try to alternate a novel and a work of nonfiction. So I think some people are squarely in one camp or the other, but I am not. But the book that I read recently that I've been recommending to absolutely everyone I meet, including literally last night to my mother, who was very questioning, was The Perfect Tuba by Sam Quinones. It's so good. And I know nothing about the tuba and frankly didn't care very much about the tuba. It is a nonfiction book about the tuba and about people who play the tuba and about the search for the perfect tuba, of which there are apparently two, and they live in Chicago and they're called the York tubas. And I just cannot recommend this book highly enough, even if you think this sounds silly or inane. Like, just give it a shot. Sam Quinones is this like really interesting, strange journalist who's written 2 books about the opioid epidemic and was like, I need a lighter subject. And like, it's so cool. Anyway, it really to me is a model of like the right writer can make any subject interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to promote a recent book about Shakespeare as well. I swear there's more to me than Shakespeare, but a recent publication by Daniel Hahn called If This Be Magic, The Unlikely Art of Shakespeare in Translation just came out from Knopf. It's about the process of what it's like to translate Shakespeare, kind of taking him as one of probably the most translated English writers. And he thinks about all of these different world languages and all of the different things that a theatrical translator has to think about, because it's, again, not just for reading, it's for writing, it's for hearing and performing. And I did the audiobook for that one, and they had a whole cast of people performing the Shakespeare text in all of these different languages from around the world. So that would just come out a few months ago. For other Shakespeare enthusiasts or performance enthusiasts, people who want to think about the translation from page to stage, If This Be Magic.
That sounds really interesting. All right. I understand that you guys are not working on another book together after this one. I know you're still in the middle, of course, of promoting this one, but I'd love to hear how you're thinking about what comes next.
Yeah, we joked, should we do a follow-up like Lady Macbeth, the biography or something, but I think maybe the market's a bit saturated. So my next project is going to be, I very much hope, a history of the fight for a right to a clean environment, especially in the 60s and 70s, like a whole range of people like farm workers and auto workers and housewives and academics united behind this idea that just as the civil rights activists had said we have a right to be free from discrimination, or women's liberation activists had said we have a right to be free from gendered violence, that everyone had a right to be free from pollution. And so it is a history of that idea and the fight and the failed fight for that right, focusing particularly on a very small town in West Virginia where a group of pretty poor people rose up against Union Carbide, which was one of the largest companies in the world and was blanketing this small town with unbelievable quantities of pollution. And they took on Carbide and they basically won, even though they didn't get the right that they fought to write into law.
I've actually just signed a contract on my next book, so very much looking forward to that. Staying in the theater world, though coming up to the 20th century. It's tentatively titled Theater for a New Age, Queer Performance in 1970s San Francisco. And it's looking at the era, the kind of decade between Stonewall and the onset of HIV/AIDS in San Francisco, and what the kind of cultural production of the city was at that time, how it was this kind of avant-garde work that was combining lifestyle and performance. There was kind of no dividing line from a number of these radical queer artists, and looking at how it's different than what we think of when we think of queer art, which is very New York focused. So this is kind of the California look at that. So very much looking forward to that project coming out in a number of years, I'm sure. But very much looking forward to that. But also, never say never. Life is long, hopefully, if we're lucky. So I think that Scott and I could definitely work on another book together. But right now, our joint project is definitely the kiddos. We'll see what the future holds.
Definitely.
Well, I'm sure the kids give you plenty to talk about also. But both of those books sound like books I want to read. So I look forward to hearing more about them. Charlie O'Malley and Scott Stern, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past. Thanks for sharing how you wrote this book together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Scott and Charlie for joining me. Their book is Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen. You'll find a link to it and all the other stuff mentioned in this episode in the show notes. If you want to keep up with the podcast and all the exciting developments coming this year, subscribe to the newsletter. Go to draftingthepast.com and click on newsletter. Until next time, remember that friends and spouses don't let friends write boring history.
You can never have too many tools. Shop DeWalt deals at Lowe's. Get a free Select DeWalt 20-Volt Max Power Tool when you buy a Select 20-Volt Max 5-amp-hour battery kit. Plus, get a free additional DeWalt 20-Volt Max 8-amp-hour battery when you buy a DeWalt 10-inch 20-Volt Max dual-bevel compounded miter saw. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 6/24 while supplies last. Selection varies by location.